Hey, if you guys have been with us, we've been taking this journey of joy. And honestly, sometimes it can be easy to be happy. It can be easy to be joyful when things are good. But what happens when life hits a rough patch? What happens when we find conflict in our life or we suffer a little bit? Are we still joyful? Well, let's see what Paul has to say in Philippians chapter 4 as how do we have joy in the midst of this opposition?
Well, good morning. Hey, happy Father's Day, and thank you for joining us today, whether you are in person or watching with us online. And before we jump into our message, you have something on your chair if you are in person, and we also want to invite online. This is going way out, talking about dads, but really just all men in general. It was on September 11th. Yeah, this is way out in your calendar. You can start scheduling this. But we are having a men's conference at our Surprise campus. Legacy Minded Men is the ministry that's helping lead this up. We got a guy speaking, Lee Rawson, who played for the NFL. Never heard, but he's legit. So he was there, I promise. He'll bring his rings to show us. But a lot of this is just talking about what does biblical manhood look like? And man, do we need that in our world today. Not only just in leading our families, but in our communities and in our jobs, is what does it look like to be a man of God? So mark that on your calendar. We'll be talking about that as it gets closer again, but we would love to have you there. But as we said, today is Father's Day. I started out my day and I actually went and got coffee because BlackRock was giving free coffee to dads, and I went through the line. She's like, that'll be $5. I'm like, you giving free coffee for dads? And she looked at me. I was like, I don't have my kids with me. I'm not in the minivan right now. And she's like, yeah. I'm like, do I have to show you pictures of my kids? Come on now. I know I look 15, but I promise I have them. But today is a day that comes with a lot of emotion. It's a day of sometimes celebrating the dads in our lives, of honoring them. But like any holiday, if we're honest, there's also some hurt. There might be some anger. There might be some regret or some resentment. And with a day like Father's Day, there becomes all these emotions that can come with it. And today, as we've been going through this series in Philippians, where we have talked about this pursuit of happiness, as it winds down and we get to this journey, we're going to see what does joy look like when things aren't good. This past week, my wife had her grandfather passed away, so she had to travel to Oklahoma. And yesterday we came and me and the kids picked her up. And so I survived 3 days, some, my own with the two little kids that were always little blessings. But we came to pick her up from the airport yesterday, which, side note, everyone and their mom is traveling right now. And so I was like, I had everything planned out. I'm like, we got to leave at this time so we can get to the airport. So I was going to do something different. I was actually going to get all the kids to the car, and we're going to go meet her. So she passed security, had flowers for her, colored a picture that I didn't color, but my daughter did because it was nicer that way. And we were going to meet her as soon as she got off and say, hey, welcome home, Mommy. But I'm driving there, and then I'm like, I don't have a dang mask. Like, I've gone through and I'm vaccinated and it's Phoenix. It's like, we don't wear masks anywhere. So I'm like, I don't have a mask in my car and it's the airport. So I'm like looking through the glove box and I'm going through, we stop in the cell phone lot. I'm going through the back of the car. And all this plan I had met one little factor I didn't think about. And it blew the whole thing up to where I just waited in the cell phone lot and picked her up on the curb and we rushed home and through Chick-fil-A. But all this happened and I had this great plan and all these things. I was going to make this happen. In my mind, I'm a perfectionist, so I want everything to go quick. I did 5 projects while my wife was gone. I wanted to make the house great when she got home. But then that little thing set it off. And when I couldn't find my mask as I'm going through, I got angry, I got annoyed. I'm like, this just blew up my plan. And too often, our joy is the same way. We're like, man, I'll be joyful when everything's going my way, when I hit all my marks today. But as soon as that hiccup happens, we're like, dang, it just messed everything up. Well, today in Philippians chapter 4, we're going to see how do we deal with that. And I think the key thought I want to give you today as Paul kind of lays on, and we're going to dig into this and kind of dissect it a little bit more, is that when opposition hits, our joy shouldn't quit. When opposition hits, our joy shouldn't quit. And if you don't hear anything today, I want to drill that into your head. And we're going to see why this is the case and how to actually do this. But so often, we're doing so great, but as soon as we get that hiccup, we let it hit off our way. Now, if we're honest, and as we kind of get into this today, that it can be easy to be happy when things are going well. These past couple of days when I was with my kids, I was like, one of the couple of days I needed to work, so I was like, one thing I know that will work with my kids is if I give them their iPads or I let them watch like Netflix and Disney Plus, they'll be happy the entire time, right? And I'm like, as long as I give them what they want, they'll be nice and happy, but honestly, parenting's not like that, and it really doesn't work, and then they're little terrors later when I tell them to go to bed. So I was like, I can't do that, but then sometimes we grow up and we have almost that toddler mentality. That, man, if everything goes my way, then I'll be happy. But here, let me get you, and as we kind of dive into this a little bit more, is a little kind of thought that continues off this, is that opposition is a matter of if, but when. And here's why we say this, is that opposition is going to come. And it's not like, hey, maybe if this happens and throws off my plan, then it will mess everything up. But it's like, if or when this is going to happen, I have to be ready for it. Because I don't know if you are an adult and you've lived through life, as frequently life just is waiting around the corner to punch you in the face when you least expect it, right? You're like, hey, everything's going great, my job's finally right, like everyone's nice to me, and then bam, it just hits you. Or bam, it's 117 outside. None of us saw it coming like that. Like, I got a heat advisory warning, and it was like 103 out. I'm like, dude, I've lived here my whole life. That's not an advisory warning. And then 2 days later, it was 117. I was like, see what you did there. But here's what we see. So let's read this in Philippians chapter 4, starting in verse 1. Here's what Paul says. He says, so then, my dearly loved and longed for brothers and sisters, my joy and my crown. And listen to this statement he uses. In this manner, stand firm in the Lord, dear friends. You see, Paul uses this phrase, in this manner, stand firm in the Lord. Meaning that we have to stand firm because something is going to happen that would make us fall. And too often, our plans we make are only good as long as everything goes according to plan. As long as we don't get that hiccup, as long as we don't forget that one thing, or that person's a jerk, or this happens, or my kids decide to go crazy and act out, because that never happens. But we're like, as long as everything goes according to plan, I'll be all right. But Paul's like, no. The opposition will come, but we can't let it dictate our emotions, our mood, and how we respond to the world around us. So let me bring us to our question, and we're going to spend the rest of our time answering this, is how do we deal with opposition joyfully? If we say when the opposition comes, we can't let it quit and destroy our joy, then how do we actually do this? Well, in Philippians chapter 4, we see that Paul is going to kind of get into the ending of his time in this letter. And we actually have 2 weeks left in this series. And through the first 3 chapters, Paul has kind of given us a roadmap to finding joy in our lives. And all that roadmap has been centered on knowing and following Jesus Christ. But here in chapter 4, he's going to give a little warning. Because this is actually the last advice he gives. The next week he's going to kind of conclude and wrap all this stuff. But here he says, well, what happens when you hit the speed bump? Because it's coming, and he says, what happens when all of a sudden things don't go my way? Because we can think that as long as I'm blessed, as long as I'm comfortable, as long as all of a sudden Sunday lines up with my schedule right, then I'll rejoice in the Lord. Then I'll follow God. I'll be happy. I'll know him. I'll try to get closer to him. But what happens when that is not the case? Well, first he tells them that we need to seek unity with other Christians. Let's keep reading in verse 2. He says this, and he's kind of getting into this section now. He says, I urge Yoda, and I tried these names so many times, and it's just not going to work, okay? So Yoda and I urge S, we're going to call her that. These are both women, to agree in the Lord. Yes, I also ask you, true partner, to help these women who have contended for the gospel at my side, along with Clement and the rest of my co-workers whose names are in the book of life. Now here, let's kind of break this section down, these verses a little bit. These are actually kind of an awkward couple verses here. Because Paul has, in a general sense, been telling them throughout this letter, saying, be united as a church. He's saying, everyone be happy. Be united to Jesus. Be united. Don't get distracted. He's like, don't be divided by politics or sports rivalries or whatever else. He said, don't let that stuff get in the way, but be united in Jesus Christ. And he said this over and over and over again. But here's where it gets awkward, is he names two people. He says, hey, you and you. Church ladies sitting on the opposite side of the, like you're letting it divide you. He's like, hey, Mary and Sue, stop it. That's really awkward, right? Like that's in God's word now. It's canon, and they get to have their names in there forever. But this is only the second time in all of Paul's letters where he calls out a conflict by names. He says, knock it off. This is a pretty big deal. The fact that he called him out means that there was something here that was brewing. There was something here that wasn't good. And sometimes in our lives, when there is something there that can cause disunity, that is such a huge conflict, sometimes we just need to call it out by name. So with that said, I want to call out Dave, who preached last week. Dave, your jokes are too funny. Because mine looked terrible after the fact. That's all I got. And I don't know about his facial hair today, but I love him. But I'm kidding. I'm not really calling out Dave. He did an amazing job yesterday. I actually preached in our surprise campus, and I listened to him on the way back, and I'm like, dang it, we even met before this, and how did he get all these great illustrations? Like, I should have used this. Did fantastic. But sometimes in our lives, we like to avoid conflict, but Paul here jumped right in. He said, this is an issue. And if we just say, sometimes we just want to attack it in a general sense. Sometimes we just want to put an anonymous Facebook post and hope they understand it. Or we just want to say and be like, oh, they'll get the picture, I'm talking about them. But sometimes you got to call a spade a spade. Now, don't tag people on Facebook. That's not what I'm saying at all. But sometimes we have to come to them and say, hey, there's an issue here. How do we resolve it? And Paul actually gives us a couple areas on how do we practically resolve conflict with other brothers and sisters in the church. And first, he says that you need to agree in the Lord, AKA be focused on the same thing. Focus on Jesus and not the other stuff. One of the saddest things I think that we've seen this past year in the lives, and maybe it's, if you're not on social media, don't get on it, but there's too many Christians who agree with people of their political party or of their political biases more than they do with brothers and sisters in the church. And that's straight ridiculous, okay? We should be able to lock arms in arms even if we don't see the method of how we do it on this world. But this should unite us above everything else. He's saying agree in the Lord. If you agree in the Lord, all the other stuff doesn't really matter. We'll resolve that. We can talk about it. We can disagree. We can fight. But if you're using that to disfellowship or break with people, he's saying wake up and shaking them and naming them by name in here. But then he doesn't tell them just to agree in the Lord. He also says, ask you, true partner, to help. Paul actually calls for the church to intervene in this as well. And sometimes that's going to happen. I don't know if you knew this, but sometimes people in the church, they disagree and they get mad. Did you guys know that? I know it never has happened here. Actually, in Phoenix, we live in a culture where people get mad, they just leave. I'm like, I haven't seen Bob in a while. I was like, I don't know. I guess I made him mad and he left. But it's like when there's issues in there, we need to talk about it. But sometimes we're kind of angry or biased or we can't resolve it on our own. So we need other people to come and speak unbiasedly and speak Christ into that situation. And then lastly, he says that whose names are in the book of life. This is important because he gives a reminder that we are on the same side, that both are saved by Jesus Christ. And that is, again, more important than anything else that conflict entails. Listen, we are naturally people. We will fight, we will disagree, we will get mad. If I haven't made you mad, you probably just haven't spent enough time with me because it's going to happen. Just ask everyone who knows me. I was going to say my wife, but no, ask my friends, ask my family. Usually the more you get to know me, the less you like me. I don't know. I'm just kidding. I hope. But all of us are going to struggle with this. But let me give you kind of 3 questions in this little section I want you to reflect on and ask yourself. Do you see yourself as a threat to the unity of the church? Do you feel like people are walking on eggshells around you? Do you feel like you're going to blow up at any moment, cause conflict? Because if that's the case, and sometimes I'm like that, I got to check my heart and be like, dude, I got to resolve something. And then next is, will you ask for help when you have a conflict? Because it's one thing to have that, but when you are mad or you do disagree with someone, will you bring others into the picture to speak into it? And lastly, are you prepared to give help? That when someone else needs you to help step in and be a peacemaker and kind of have this resolve, will you be there for them? You see, one of the things we champion here at Cross Church all the time is authenticity. Is we don't want you to walk in and have to put on a church face as soon as you move through these doors. And we want you to be real in who you are. Because I'm always going to be real in who I am. This past week, I got coffee with some people who've been checking out our church, and they just asked me question after question, shooting at me. And I'm like, yep, this is it, this is how we do it, blah, blah, blah. And I just gave them to them. This is what, we're not hiding anything. Because sometimes we keep those back, and we're like, well, I have this, and then we get later down the road, and we're like, oh, I don't like that at all. It's no, let's be open and talk about it and see how we can have a bigger mission focused on God. So here we need to have unity with other believers and Christians, but next we need to deal with opposition by looking to Jesus to supply our joy. Let's keep reading in verse 4. And it says this, Paul says, rejoice in the Lord always. I will say it again, rejoice. Now I know this is a really small verse and actually probably one that's been widely talked about before or it's been quoted, but inside this verse, a couple interesting things is one, is Paul has said this already in the letter. And in ancient literature, when you didn't type things, you couldn't copy and paste it and just say, all right, I already said that thought. You had to write it again. So they didn't write things numerous times unless they wanted to emphasize a point. Meaning he's saying this because this is a central theme throughout this book of Philippians. That's why we call this the pursuit of happiness, right? Joy and happiness is scattered throughout this book. So he's saying this is a central theme to it. But then, even more interesting, is he says it twice in the same sentence. And in the original language here of Greek, they actually didn't have anything like punctuation like we have in our English language. So many of your Bibles will show it says rejoice, exclamation point, because when you said something twice in a sentence, you're beating it over the head with them. So what Paul is saying, rejoice, rejoice, rejoice in the Lord. And too often, we rejoice in a lot of other things. We rejoice in our job. We rejoice in our family. Man, I am guilty of this. We rejoice in our sports teams, okay? I've been my 9 went to 10 ever since the Suns have been in the Western Conference Finals. If they win the finals, I'm going to ride that 10 for a while. But as dumb as that is, and it's exciting, and let's enjoy it. But if I'm finding my joy and satisfaction in there, man, I'm just waiting for it to go off a cliff. Trust me, I know as an Arizona sports fan. But so often we're I'll be joyful if my job is good. I'll be joyful if my marriage is good. And then those things disappoint us because that's what happens in broken, mortal things. But when we rejoice in God, God is up here. He doesn't disappoint. God doesn't have good days and bad days like we do. Instead, God has great, perfect days every single day for all of eternity and forever. He is the same yesterday, today, and forever. So when we put our joy in something that's not changing, something that is greater than us, then we're not just rolling the roller coaster of emotion that we get from others and ourselves. He's saying, rejoice in the Lord. Look to Jesus to supply our joy and not anyone else. And here's what's beautiful is then this allows us to then show grace to everyone around us. Let's keep reading in verse 5. He says, let your graciousness be known to everyone. The Lord is near. Now, the word graciousness here is actually kind of difficult to translate. There's a few different interpretations of here. It can be translated as graciousness, as reasonableness, or gentleness. But all of these words are the opposite of being selfish or being out of control. So what Paul is trying to push us here is he's saying, show grace and patience with people. Because when you extend grace, it's not about being right, but it's about making sure someone is all right. My kids, sometimes they don't listen. I know it's hard to believe. You're why are your stories always about kids? That's all I got. That's what I observe. But sometimes they don't listen, and they're my son, he's 3, and Archer, and I'll be Archie, stop jumping on the couch. Stop jumping on the couch. Stop jumping on the couch. And he keeps doing it, and then finally he falls off, he hits his head on the coffee table, and he cries. Now, how do you respond to that situation? What do you do? Nothing. Okay, you guys are really ready for this. Okay. There's one of two ways usually you respond. One is you comfort him and say it's okay and give him a hug, and my wife easily does that and jumps to it. Here's what I jump to. I told you not to do that. I said, this is what you get. This is the consequences of your action. Life lesson, buddy. Like, come on here. I told you not to jump on the couch because I told you this would happen. I'm right. See, now you reap the benefits of your consequences. And then I hug him after I give him that little lecture. But so often as adults, we become the same way. We're like, I told you I was right. I told you not to do that. I told you it would turn out this way. And instead of caring whether the person's okay and extending grace and love and forgiveness, we're saying, man, I was right. You should have never done that. And if you had just listened to me, you wouldn't be in this situation. And all of us can fall into that trap. And when we're saying show graciousness, we're saying that opposition is going to arrive, but you can either fight to be vindicated and fight to be right, or you can fight to love those and help those around you. But here's kind of the question that comes then. How do we balance that? How do we balance being right and speaking truth with being gracious and loving those around us? Because if we're honest, there are injustices, there is sin, there is evil in our world that we need to call out. We need to call a spade a spade. How do we balance that with being loving and being gracious? Because sometimes we can feel like, well, if I show too much grace, then evil is going to keep on going. If I don't speak out, then it's going to keep going that direction. Well, Paul kind of continues. And I think he tells us in this next section to relieve anxiety through prayer. Let's keep reading in verse 6. Picking up in verse 6 of chapter 4, he says, don't worry about anything. But in everything, through prayer and petition with thanksgiving, present your requests to God. And the peace of God, which surpasses all understanding, will guard your hearts and minds in Christ Jesus. You see, I don't think there's an accident here that Paul puts these verses back to back. He says, be gracious, and then don't worry. Be gracious and don't be anxious. And here's the thing is, we sometimes think is I can't show grace in all situations or our future will be doomed. Let me come back to my situation with my kids. Part of me in my rational brain says, well, if I don't tell him in the moment that these are the consequences of your actions and I just show him love, then he'll just keep repeating it over and over again. So I got to say, I told you to do this, you did it, here are the consequences, so this is why I told you, like, don't do it again. But sometimes we think that we think that as adults as well. Like, I need to speak out against this evil. I need to make sure everyone knows I'm on the right side of history, or I'm on this way. I got to speak out against all this. And if I show too much grace, then I'm not speaking truth to the sin and the evil in our worlds. John Piper defines anxiety, and here's where I think it builds is because when we sometimes have this kind of struggle in our heart, it builds this anxiousness in us. And he says it this way, that anxiety seems to be an intense desire for something accompanied by a fear of the consequences of not receiving it. You see, we worry when we imagine the future in a terrible way. We worry when we think if we don't do enough, the future won't be okay. If we don't do enough, if we're not good stewards of the world we have, if we don't speak out to the evils in our world, then our future is going to be doomed. Our children are going to pay for it. And Paul says, hey, God's in control. Stop trying to fix the entire world and pray, saying, God, I thank you that you are in control. And I ask that you calm me, knowing I can't fix all the issues. See, our world is wrought with a lot of issues, with racism, with abortion, with poverty in our world, with relation. There's so much things, and we're like, man, if I just spoke out, then we could eliminate all these things in our worlds. But honestly, that's not under our control. Do we need to speak evil when evil comes? Yes. But we can't bear that burden that is just going to make us more anxious, that is going to make us more frustrated of why is our world not magically fixing because we were passing a legislation, or fixing because I wrote a Facebook post that condemned this. It should have fixed everything. Instead, God's like, no, I'm in control. I'm still on my throne. Just be faithful in following me. And you see, I think that begs the question then, well, what is under our power? If I can't fix the world, if I can't wave a magic wand and eliminate all the huge societal issues in our world, what can I do? I can be the best father, the best husband, the best neighbor, the best coworker, the best family member I can in my life with those around me. Which leads into our last point, And starting with, we need to consider greater things. Let's keep reading in verse 8 of chapter 4. Paul wraps up this little area and says, finally, brothers and sisters, whatever is true, whatever is honorable, whatever is just, whatever is pure, whatever is lovely, whatever is commendable, if there is any moral excellence, and if there is anything praiseworthy, dwell on these things. Do what you have learned, received and heard from me and seen in me, and the God of peace will be with you. See, Paul before tells us is that we can't fix all these issues, so we need to fall at the feet of Jesus Christ. We need to pray to God for comfort and for his will to be done. But then he doesn't say it doesn't stop there. Then he calls us into action. So what can we do? And he gives two practical ways of doing it. He says first is to consume the right things over the wrong. You know, we naturally understand this. Think of it this way, and I'm going to give you another kid's example, is you don't put a kid in front of a TV with a remote and say, watch whatever you want on Netflix. Instead, you put it on kids' Netflix, so all they can watch is terrible shows like Storybots and things that are really annoying and will get stuck in your head forever, and they can only watch things that are like Y or PG at most. You don't say, hey, start a Netflix show, and it's Netflix, so who knows what you're going to get. You're like, hey, watch that. There might be like blood and everything else in there. But instead, you limit their content because you don't want them to consume the wrong stuff that is going to be like, oh, that's too much for a kid to handle. And Paul is saying the same thing here, is whatever we're going to consume is ultimately going to shape our heart and minds of what then we're going to push out. So listen to that again. He says, whatever is true, not false, whatever is honorable, not dishonorable and shameful, whatever is just, not whatever is unjust and wicked, whatever is pure, not whatever is defiled, whatever is lovely, not whatever is ugly and disgusting, whatever is commendable, dwell on these things. He's saying you have to rewire your brain. You have to focus on the right things. And the way to start that is in God's word. Is that so often we're like, man, I just wish I was a nicer person. Well, what are you consuming? If all you're consuming is what the world has around you, if all you're reading is social media or watching the news that's just full of negativity, why are you surprised you're negative? And so often we think this is such crazy, but we fill our kids with the right stuff so that they can grow up, so they can do that, but then we forget that lesson along the way. And Paul is saying, dwell, take to heart, bask in these things so that they will change your heart, they will change your mind, and you will be motivated and turn towards Christ. But then the second part of this, and we hit on this last week as well, Dave kind of talked about this, is he says not only to think about them, but follow other people's example as well. Check out verse 9. He said, do what you have learned and received and heard from me and seen in me, and the God of peace will be with you. You see, Paul knew he was ahead of them in the game. This church he planted 10 years earlier. He was almost 20 years into his ministry. He knew he was a more mature believer than anyone in that church. So it wasn't something arrogant. Instead, he was saying, hey, follow me because I'm a couple steps ahead of you, and follow me as I follow Christ. And you see, that's what a church family is designed for. Do you have people who are helping you walk this journey? Because as Scott said earlier, if you are trying to do this alone, man, you are just going to fail time after time after time after time. You need a great example? I'll give you a sports example. Kevin Durant was amazing and just lost in a Game 7 because all his team was hurt and it was just one dude, and he lost to a team. It's like we need other people around us. We need people to pick us up when we fall. No matter how awesome we think we are, no matter how holy we think we are, we need those who we can follow their examples, who can come around us so that we can march on this life towards Christ. And all this kind of comes full circle is how do we respond when the hard times come? Because it's not if they're going to come, it's when they're going to come. Are we going to look to restore relationships when that conflict happens, when we don't see eye to eye, when we get mad at a brother or a sister, even a family member, like not just spiritually, but even in those people that we're related to? When that conflict comes, are we just going to like cut it off and say, I'm done? Or are we going to seek to unify that relationship? Will you look for joy from Jesus rather than the situations that change constantly around you? Will you show grace rather than pride? Say, it's okay if I'm not right in this situation, but I'm making sure that person is all right. Will you be content in God's plan rather than anxious for the future and making sure everything is going to be okay, but knowing that He is in control? And will you aspire for greater things rather than being content and okay with the sinfulness that's in our lives? You see, my prayer is that when the opposition hits, when life throws something at you, when life just punches you in the face, that you look to Jesus to make sure your joy doesn't quit with it. Let's pray this morning.